By the mid-60s, the coalition had been in power for over 15 years, becoming the longest government in Australian history. Despite 7 continuous election wins, Robert Menzies would not be contesting this election. Instead, he would be relying on his successor to weather the stormy seas and pull off another election win. And if you think that's the only water pun I'm going to make this episode, you are surely mistaken. Despite his ever-increasing age, Menzies would continue to govern Australia through most of the Coalition's 7th term in office. In this time, he would pass a few small reforms, including ending the open discrimination against married women in the public service, allowing them to retain their jobs after marriage. Despite making some small policy changes, Menzies would also start a major political engagement which would define politics for the next decade. After the Second World War, the nation of Vietnam found itself split into two, with a communist-ruled north and an anti-communist-ruled south. Sound familiar? Since the 50s, the United States had been supporting South Vietnam from northern insurgents, who hoped to topple the South and create a unified Vietnam under communist rule. In August 1964, the USS Maddox would be engaged by North Vietnamese naval forces in what would become known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. While this incident would later become the centre of a major US government controversy, at this point in time it would be used to increase the US's support of South Vietnam, in which over 200,000 US troops would be deployed to the region. As an ally of the United States and a fierce anti-communist, Menzies would also send troops to assist the US in Vietnam. Menzies would adjust Australia's conscription policy in a similar manner to former Prime Minister John Curtin, by claiming that the Southeast Pacific was in Australia's sphere of influence of defence. To avoid another 1917 constitutional crisis, Menzies would include an opt-out clause where conscripts could choose to remain within Australia's borders if they so desired. However, this would be his last major political decision. In December 1965, Menzies turned 71, and he would begin discussions with his close allies at home and in Canberra about his intentions to retire from Parliament. The official statement would be made in January the next year, with the first ever political press conference shown on TV.
I am now 71, as you all know. By the due date of the next election, and I'm assuming that it will occur at the due time, I would be 72. I couldn't see myself at 72, I couldn't see myself saying to the people of Australia, I want you to give me another term.
The transfer of power within the Liberal Party would go over very smoothly, as seen with Menzies' successor, Harold Edward Holt, being elected unopposed as the 17th Prime Minister of Australia. Born in 1908, Holt would be the first true ocean blue Prime Minister, with all previous Prime Ministers being born before the country even existed. Only took us 65 years? Holt swam into Canberra in the 1935 Falconer by-election at the age of 27, making him the youngest parliamentarian at the time. Over his 30-year career in federal politics, Holt freestyled his way up the ranks of the Liberal Party, becoming Minister for Labour and later Treasurer, after Fadden resigned. As Treasurer, Holt would establish Australia's new currency, the Australian dollar, as well as work closely with Menzies as Deputy Leader. Holt's ascension to Prime Minister came with a rather small splash, with most current Cabinet Ministers retaining their positions. In his first year as PM, Holt would bring about major immigration reform, which sought to wash away large amounts of the White Australia policy. Gone were the extended naturalisation periods for non-white immigrants, as well as mandates to limit non-white immigration numbers. The result of this policy saw waves of Asian immigration almost tenfold, and today Asians make up the largest minority in Australia at 16%. Holt would also see Australia turn its attention away from Britain and towards nations in the local area, specifically the United States. In 1966, US President Lyndon B. Johnson became the first US President to visit Australia, and he would end up forming a close relationship with Holt. Holt would continue Australia's support towards the Vietnam War by sailing additional troops to the region to assist. He did this despite declaring that Australia would not be increasing its military commitments. While visiting the US, Holt would make the following address, demonstrating Australia's and America's alliance.
That you have an admiring friend, a staunch friend, that will be all the way with LBJ.
Holt had meant the statement as a gesture of goodwill, making use of LBJ's 1964 re-election campaign slogan. However, his critics saw it as a form of political intimidation, and it would intensify the anti-war sentiment that had begun to grow in Australia. Trying to take advantage of the anti-war movement would be the Labour Party, still under the leadership of Arthur Calwell. Despite being deeply unpopular with the public, Calwell refused to step down as leader and hoped to use the anti-war movement to make a comeback after Labour's poor showing in the last election. Unfortunately, Calwell's 1966 election campaign would be marred in conflict. In 1964, Australia would have its first of 3 standalone Senate elections in which Labour would perform poorly, losing a seat to former Queensland Premier and now DLP Senator Vince Gare, who would later become leader of the breakaway party. Despite originally pushing for unification, by 1965 talks between the ALP and DLP had broken down due to DLP demands relating to getting top leadership positions in the party, and thus the two parties would remain divided. Meanwhile, in the same year, Deputy Labour leader Gough Whitlam successfully changed the Labour platform to also end support of the White Australia policy, as well as give the federal Labour leader and the deputy leader seats in the Labour executive. He did this against Calwell's will, and the two's relationship would deteriorate. Eventually, Calwell would move to expel Whitlam from the party after Whitlam broke ranks on denying public school funding. Whitlam would narrowly survive this expulsion move, and in response countered with something modern-day Australians are all too familiar with, a leadership spill motion. However, this would fail with 2/3 backing Calwell. The election was set for the 26th of November 1966, and Calwell would make several appearances at anti-war rallies, attempting to drum up support for Labour's campaign. After leaving one of these rallies at the Morsman Town Hall in Sydney, Calwell would get into a government car to be driven back to his hotel. He would then be approached by 19-year-old Peter Tonkin, who would proceed to pull off a .22 caliber rifle out of his coat and open fire on the opposition leader. Calwell luckily had the car window up at the time and it would prevent the bullet hitting him. However, he was still hit with multiple shards of glass. Tonkin would immediately be arrested and Calwell would be rushed to hospital in the first attempted political assassination in the nation's history. Tonkin would be given a life sentence and would eventually be sent to a psychiatric hospital. Calwell, who had not been seriously harmed, would be dismissed from hospital and the next day would continue campaigning. Years later, Calwell would eventually visit the detained Tonkin and the two would make amends. Tonkin would be released in 1976 and would go on to have a successful career in literature, becoming a renowned author, and today lives in Brisbane. Now let's get back to the election results. And the winner was Robert Menzies and the force of habit. In a giant blue wave of an election win, Holt had picked up 10 seats to hold a whopping 82 seats, the biggest win for the Liberal coalition yet. Holt's numbers were also boosted with the seat of the Northern Territory, as the territories had now become full-fledged seats, increasing the total number of seats in Parliament to 124. Despite winning more seats than Menzies ever did, Holt received little credit as most saw this election as a rejection of Calwell, whose approval rating after 6 years had fallen to a pathetic 24%, according to one poll. Calwell, who had only won 41 seats, half of what Holt had won, would finally see the writing on the wall and resign as leader the following year. Calwell was a man out of time, a Depression-era politician in the middle of the 60s, who still supported the White Australia policy in an era of progressivism. Fun fact, after being expelled from the Labour Party, Minister for Batman, Sam Benson, would recontest his seat in this election and win, becoming the first non-two-party aligned member to win a lower house seat since 1949. With Calwell's resignation, the door was finally open for Whitlam to take over the party, which he did. Beating out left-wing candidate Dr. Jim Cairns, Whitlam would become the 11th leader of the Labour Party and would begin to implement big changes to the federal party to modernise it for the upcoming elections. Come back next time for the election of 1969.